China represents the most significant long-term strategic threat to the United States. I believe that fundamentally, China is a global threat that must be confronted globally, region by region. Among those regions, pressingly, is Africa. China is exercising its military, economic, and political power and advancing its authoritarian agenda, all while undermining the sovereignty of African nations and the strategic interest of the United States.
America's neo-colonial game in Africa just fell apart, and Washington is scrambling, making desperate, hollow statements to salvage a crumbling image of power. In this video, we're going to expose how America's neo-colonial strategy in Africa just collapsed, and why this makes a systemic shift in global geopolitics. If you care about Africa's future, this video will show you both the opportunities and the risks in this new multipolar world order. If you don't know me, my name is TJ. I'm Nigerian and British mixed, and on this channel, we talk about African geopolitics.
There is a consensus emerging. First, that for decades the United States has been disregarding acute national security challenges and critical opportunities in Africa. And second, that for the safety and prosperity of Americans, we can no longer afford to do so. I believe that consensus is both correct and long overdue. The emphasis and attention that President Trump has already given to Africa is a demonstration of that consensus. Those challenges and opportunities are vast. They include threats posed by China, Russia, and Iran, as well as an array of regional crises. There are also wide-ranging options for cooperation on everything from critical minerals to technology and even space development. I intend for this subcommittee to serve as a primary forum for shaping and articulating the policies of the United States towards Africa on these issues and beyond. The Constitution envisions foreign policy as a tug-of-war between Congress and the executive. I have no doubt that over the coming months and years, there will be many instances in which members of this committee have vigorous and robust debates with administration officials testifying before us. Such debates are a necessary part of formulating policy. However, I also have every expectation that there will be significant areas of bipartisan convergence and agreement. Many of the challenges we face are so fundamental and have been neglected for so long that what needs to be done is relatively clear. We have an enormous amount of work to do. These hearings will allow for the formulation of U.S. policies and will more fundamentally demonstrate that the United States has a policy towards Africa. Today's hearing is on China's malign influence in Africa. China represents the most significant long-term strategic threat to the United States. I believe that fundamentally, China is a global threat that must be confronted globally, region by region. Among those regions, pressingly, is Africa. China is exercising its military, economic, and political power and advancing its authoritarian agenda, all while undermining the sovereignty of African nations and the strategic interest of the United States. Politically and diplomatically, China is leveraging its growing influence to marginalize U.S. allies, most notably Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party is pouring billions into its Belt and Road Initiative, trapping African countries in unsustainable debt and using these arrangements to block American interests. The primary reason why China is investing so heavily in Africa is critical minerals. China already dominates critical mineral global supply chains, and China is aggressively locking up control over these resources across Africa. That leaves the United States vulnerable to being cut off. Xi Jinping talks about, quote, world socialism, and declares that, quote, realizing communism has been the party's supreme ideal and ultimate objective. The CCP is building a military capable of global power projection and creating regional economic blocs that exclude the United States because they intend to project power globally at the expense of core American national security interests. Countering Chinese malign influence in Africa requires us to reshape the paradigm of U.S.-Africa policy. For decades, U.S.-Africa policy has been synonymous with aid and development. Today, we are changing that paradigm. Today and into the future, U.S.-Africa policy will revolve around investment-led commercial diplomacy. To counter China, we need to partner with our allies and friends in Africa to promote, expand, and grow trade and investment relationships. To be an alternative to China, we have to create real alternatives to China. This is what we will discuss today. I want to thank Ambassador Futrell for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony and insights into this critical issue.
So the clip that you just watched was of Ted Cruz speaking at a Senate hearing about Africa, China, and what he called a malign influence. If you listen closely to the tone and his wording, this isn't diplomacy at all. It's actually desperation. It's the sound of a superpower realizing that the world it once dominated is slipping away. And honestly, I'm fed up with this propaganda. There is a coordinated campaign in Western media and politics to paint China as a communist, military controlling force that wants to take over the world. It's lazy, it's dishonest, it's hypocritical. America is the one with more than 750 military bases around the world, compared to China's one. America is the one that has dominated the global financial system and the international military order for the past 100 years. It's had every opportunity to build fair partnerships in Africa, to create balanced trade, to help the continent industrialize and prosper. But instead, it pillaged resources, destabilized nations, and installed puppet leaders while showing little or no concern for the ordinary citizens of Africa. This behavior sits atop of a historical foundation built on slavery and exploitation and racial hierarchy. And now, that same nation that exploited Africa for generations has the audacity to frame China, who is offering infrastructure, technology, and comparatively fairer partnerships, as an evil empire. It's frankly laughable. It's a joke, and it must be called out for what it is: propagandistic nonsense. Many of you have dropped comments asking how you can support this channel, even offering to donate or help financially. Until recently, I had no way to make this possible, but now through my Substack, it's never been easier for you to lend me some support. There's a free tier where you'll get one email per week, and for just $5 a month, about the price of a nice coffee, you'll receive a daily written update from all of my content, everything I produce. I'll be engaging with those of you who join, asking your thoughts on how to serve you and the continent better. Sometimes my videos do get demonetized, and there's also a small chance, as we saw with the Platform Africa stream, that a channel like this could be deplatformed. Even if the worst happens, we can regroup, rebuild, and keep pushing forward. We don't want any third party controlling this message, so with email backing us up, we can communicate directly. Thank you in advance for signing up. I look forward to connecting with you, not just on YouTube, but via email as well. Ted Cruz said China is undermining African sovereignty and threatening America's strategic interests. But the truth is simple. Africa's sovereignty has only ever mattered to Washington when it could be used as a tool to defend America's access and America's control. If Washington truly respected sovereignty, it would have respected Africa's choices long ago, even those choices that didn't serve US interests directly. Cruz warns about Chinese authoritarianism in Africa, but the irony is staggering. Washington speaks of democracy while funding coups, sanctions, and information wars. It accuses others of manipulation while doing the very same thing, often even worse. Africa doesn't need another savior. It needs the freedom to chart its own course. Cruz is there, calling out China as the most significant long-term threat to the United States and highlights Africa as the key battleground. Yet he never mentions Africa's aspirations, industrialization, technology, jobs, or control over its resources. The continent simply isn't treated as a partner by America, but as a chessboard. It's the same Cold War strategy retold in the new era. Cruz says that China is pouring billions into the Africa Belt and Road Initiative, trapping nations in debt, blocking American interests. But when the IMF and the World Bank force African economies into austerity, dismantling industries and destroying local control, Washington calls that reform. The real issue isn't debt, it's dominance. When Africa holds the leash, it's called aid. But when someone else does, it's a trap. And the so-called debt trap accusation doesn't even hold up under scrutiny. There has been no significant default that anyone can point to based on Chinese deals. And Cruz certainly doesn't cite a single example. In fact, there are numerous Western IMF and World Bank programs that cause real unrest and issues across the continent, where Kenyan armed forces unleashed live bullets, killing protesters. Much of those riots started because of IMF austerity, nothing to do with Chinese lending. In fact, across the continent of Africa, I've not seen a single riot or civil unrest as a result of Chinese debt restructuring. The evidence shows that Chinese lending terms are genuinely renegotiated if there are any problems, and certainly not enforced through coercion. The myth of the Chinese debt trap is a talking point and not a fact. And then comes the so-called new policy, investment and commercial diplomacy. But this is just the old game with new branding. Investment without African equity or technology transfer is just extraction. It's commercial diplomacy that exports raw minerals and imports poverty. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the modern day colonial economics that America pushes. And here's the part that Cruz and the rest of Washington don't like to admit. America's industrial empire and military complex relies on rare earth minerals, cobalt, lithium, and other critical minerals, most of which are found in Africa. Every aircraft carrier, missile system, fighter jet, and smartphone depends on them, and China controls the refining, the processing, and the supply chains. That means America's military and the very foundation of its global power is fundamentally dependent on the very country it calls its greatest enemy. The vice is not just economic, it's strategic. Without African minerals refined through Chinese channels, America's war machine and military-industrial complex would grind to a halt. Since that Senate statement, things have gotten even worse for the United States. Trump's tariffs and reckless policies pushed China to tighten its grip even further, locking down the rare earth market and reinforcing global dependence. I made a number of videos talking about this already. What started as a trade war initiated by Trump has become a full-blown resource chokehold. Beijing, diversifying its buyers, strengthened ties across Africa, and built redundancies across Asia and Latin America. America, meanwhile, is fighting for relevance in a world that no longer needs it to function. This is the price of arrogance, a century of dominance wasted on domination instead of partnership. America had its chance. It had the time, the power, and the wealth to build genuine relationships with Africa, one based on respect, mutual growth, and shared prosperity, putting the awful atrocities of slavery behind it. But it chose exploitation, manipulation, and control. Now the tables have turned and they cry foul. It's the height of hypocrisy. Cruz's speech is not about protecting democracy at all. It's about protecting control. It's information warfare wrapped in moral language. Words like malign influence and world socialism are psychological weapons designed to prepare Western audiences for interventions, wars, destabilization actions, much like they did with Libya when they got Gaddafi out of power. It's the same formula we've seen over and over again. And it's a joke that they would say anything about being humanitarian champions. Right now, for the first time in modern history, Africa has leverage. The world cannot build its future without Africa's minerals, energy, and innovation. That gives the continent real power if it can act with unity and clarity. Partnerships with the Global South are expanding rapidly, and the new South-South trade frameworks that bypass the US dollar are starting to take shape. The BRICS alliance, now attracting an ever-increasing number of African nations, is a major part of that shift. The multipolar order is no longer a concept, it's an inevitability. And the more America resists this reality, the more painful its transition will be. The opportunities for Africa lie in embracing these new partnerships, deepening cooperation with China and other Global South nations, using this landscape to demand value addition, industrialization, and true sovereignty over raw resource extraction and exports. Yet with these opportunities comes danger. America's desperate to maintain its global hegemony, and this may lead to the ramp-up of predatory behavior, covert destabilization, propaganda campaigns, and even military interference in a last-ditch attempt to hold on to its power. Africa must remain vigilant. Recognizing this pattern early is how the continent protects itself. America's neo-colonial game didn't fall apart because China is so perfect. China does have its issues, but it fell apart because the entire system depends on Africa never having alternatives. Now, China is an alternative, and with the continent having options, the game is over. The unipolar world order ended, not with war, but with exposure. Washington can shout about values and threats all it wants, but shouting doesn't refine awe. It doesn't build factories, and it doesn't create trust. So the next time Washington talks about partnership, remember the history. They've had 100 years to build one, but they chose empire instead. And now, as the world changes, Africa finally has the power to choose itself. I would love to know what you guys think about this. I'm quite fired up, and I'm sure you can feel it in the delivery. Please leave your thoughts down in the comment section. But if you have nothing to say, would it be too much for me to ask you to write the words "Africa now has leverage" in the comment section? It just lets me know that you watched the video to the end, you like the message, you like the channel, and you want me to continue. Thank you so much for watching today, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Thank you.